I'd like to welcome Dr. Einat Wilf to Thinking Aloud. Einat Wilf is a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. She was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Born and raised in Israel, Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israel Defense Forces, foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey & Company. Dr. Wilf has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She was the Goldman Visiting Professor at Georgetown University and is a lecturer at Reichman University in Israel. Dr. Wilf is the author of 7 books that explore key issues in Israeli society. We Should All Be Zionists, published in 2022, brings together her essays from the past 4 years on Israel, Zionism, and the Path to Peace. Also, she co-authored The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace, which was published in 2022. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Einat Wilf to Thinking Aloud and the Valley Beth Shalom community.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So I wanted to start out like I start all of my interviews post October 7th. Where were you on October 7th, and how did the day unfold for you?
Like many Israelis, I was at home. I was in Tel Aviv. Like many Israelis, I had just come back from vacation. This was the Sukkot holiday. It's a school holiday here in Israel. So my family, my kids, we had just come back from a nice vacation. We were home for Shabbat. We arrived the Friday before. And I was woken up by my young daughter screaming that there's a siren, rockets. I woke up, we ran to the safe room. And as I'm sure you're hearing from many people, we all thought that it is same old, same old. So another barrage of rockets, something's going on. We'll stay in the safe room for a little bit, and then all will resume as normal. But I opened Twitter, and of course, it began. I mean, typically that's where you get a sense of what's going on. And by, it became clear that this was different. There was something about a truck with terrorists, and this seemed really weird. And then, again, I'm sure you're hearing the same from everyone. It slowly began to be clear that this is something of a different magnitude, of a different nature, of a different order. And we just spent the day in gloom and doom, following the news and realizing that things are going to be different.
And how would you characterize the atmosphere in Israel right now?
It's odd. So on some aspects, you have a kind of fragile routine that is back. Schools are back almost to the schedule pre-October 7th. My children had their first relatively routine week at school. Some people are back to work. And so on one aspect, there's almost a routine, but there is a very clear sense that it's fragile. There's a question mark over that routine. And of course, nothing around it is routine. People are still mobilized in huge numbers for the military. There are still rocket attacks, just fewer, but we still occasionally go to the safe room. And the country is still at war. So this is still consuming how we feel, what we think about, and also just a lot of feelings. I mean, every Shabbat morning, since that Shabbat, I wake up with a knot in my stomach and I can barely breathe. And it's almost become the regular way that I wake up on Shabbat. Everything, someone wrote beautifully, they said, so from now on, everything has an aftertaste of sadness. So no matter what we do, there's just that kind of this permanent sadness. So that's the situation now. It's a kind of odd in between.
Your Twitter posts and being able to follow you through this entire horrific episode has really shed a lot of light on it for me. And if people don't follow you, I think they should follow you. Even in the release of the initial hostages, the first several hostages, how you posted statements by other Jews who have been let go out of captivity. You posted a statement by Albert Einstein when he was let go out of Nazi-controlled Germany, and he made a public positive statement about that was clearly forced. And you compared them. So one of the thoughtful Twitter pieces of light is your account. Let's go to your books, because I think that you have a lot to teach, specifically American Jewry. I'm going to start with your most recent book, We Should All Be Zionists. Mm-hmm. You published this in English, obviously, for an American audience, or we assume that everything published in English is for an American audience, right? That's how Americans think. And why do you think we have to make the case again and again and again for why everyone ought to be Zionistic?
So the title emerged from several directions. The book deals first with the rising anti-Zionism and the process by which it took me to realize that anti-Zionism was, oddly enough, not about Israel. And that seems like a weird statement, because when we see anti-Zionism, when we see things like Zionism equals apartheid or racism or genocide or Nazism, we have for years made the mistake of assuming, I made that mistake of assuming that this is a good faith debate about Israel. And therefore, we should now explain that Israel's not apartheid, and we'll explain that Arabs have citizenship and they're judges and all that. And it took me a while to realize that we have wasted years, if not decades, of efforts in engaging in those discussions as if they were good faith discussions, only to realize that these were just the respectable mask by which an assault on Jewish life was taking place. One of the pieces talks about what I call the pound of flesh dynamic, where, unlike Shakespeare, it's actually the Jews who are demanded to hand over mostly a metaphorical pound of flesh, essentially to mutilate their Jewish identity in order to fit in order to be accepted to social justice circles, academia, journalism, places where Jews are overrepresented and when they have historically seen as their home. Because if you look basically at white supremacist anti-Semitism, you generally don't have Jews being in those circles. That's not their social group. But social justice circles, academia, journalism, those are places where Jews exist in large numbers. In many cases, those are places Jews built. And the fact that anti-Zionism was rising in those places, I think, is precisely because it was the respectable mask by which an assault on Jewish life could be mounted and not immediately resisted. Everybody knows to resist the old kind of anti-Semitism. Of course, when the old kind of anti-Semitism was new, it also enjoyed respectability. That's something people forget. But again, like, you need a mask of respectability so that people will let their guard down. So I talk about how young Jews with whom I interacted have readopted Zionism and basically calling themselves Zionists as just a way to tell the anti-Zionists to go away, because the realization was that anti-Zionism has the dynamic of bullying. And the only way to stand up to bullies is basically to project confidence. So I spoke about Zionism as a shorthand of projecting Jewish confidence. Another aspect was about Zionism as the way to get to peace. I discussed in length how the essence of the conflict is between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting the Jews not to have a state, essentially a conflict between Zionism and anti-Zionism. And I posit that the conflict will be over when the Arab world will essentially adopt Zionism, when the Arab world will look at the Jewish people not as a foreign implant, that needs to be ousted violently, but rather as Abraham, as part and parcel of the region, a people with a history and a culture that belongs very much to the region. So my vision for peace is one that posits on the Arab and Islamic embrace of support for Jewish self-determination. So that's another aspect of why we should all be Zionists. And of course, also in Israel, always good to remember why we're here.
So this past summer, I had the opportunity to travel to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Jerusalem as a part of a group called the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition that wanted to better understand and to celebrate and to offer gratitude to all of the parties in the Abraham Accords. It was a very hopeful moment for me, very hopeful, to celebrate Shabbat in Dubai in that way. And since October 7th, I've begun to question almost every moment of the trip in a way that you think to yourself, is it genuine? Is it not genuine? Is that the hopeful path forward, in the sense that it felt like we were very close to Riyadh as well. It felt like in many ways, this is a struggle within the Arab world. Is the entirety of the Arab world going to accept Israel? And is Iran going to allow that to happen? Is that how you see what's playing out? A kind of fallout within the Arab world, or is this simply going to be a battle between Zionists and anti-Zionists till the end?
Oh, no, this is definitely a battle within the Arab world, which is a much, much bigger issue. Sometimes I call us collateral benefit. I mean, the story of the Abraham Accords. We're not the central issue here. The central issue is the future of the Arab world, the nature of Islam. And when I discuss the prospects for Arab Zionism, for a true Arab and Muslim embrace of the Jewish right to self-determination, understanding that Zionism is basically the modern expression of the historical connection, so not something that's like out of nowhere, I always was very clear to say that on the one hand, this is what gives me hope, and that this is actually the only way we can get to peace. There's no other way. We can get to some arrangements, we can have some ceasefires, but if we're talking about peace, then the only way is to have an Arab and Muslim embrace of the Jewish right to self-determination in their historic homeland. But I also made it very clear that this is a minority voice in the Arab world. I said that it's the first time we even have that voice, which is a huge change. And if some of you follow me on Twitter, you know that I amplify Arab and recently even a Palestinian voice that are pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, that explain actually how they emerged from a very anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist Arab world to understand that this is what's needed to get to peace. So we now have those voices, something we did not necessarily have in the past. And those are voices that are even heads of state. But I always said that I'm under no illusion that this is a minority voice, that still the majority of the Arab world is committed to the notion that Israel is some kind of foreign implant. When they use words like colonial, European, white, they're basically using synonyms for the word foreign. They're basically saying you don't belong here. And because you don't belong here, with enough violence and patience, we'll throw you out. October 7th should be understood in this context. I read a piece by a senior American general who said, you know, the massacre, the atrocities of October 7th, I've seen it all. I've seen it across the Middle East. And he says they're always the means by which a group conveys to another group, you don't belong here, get out. This is the purpose of the atrocities. That's why they have to be so brutal, and also why they have to be out there and visual and filmed, and because the idea is indeed to terrorize a people into leaving. So this is still the majority vision in the Arab world, but for the first time, we have alternative voices. That's what gives me hope. We should understand that Palestinians, having been for so long the spearhead of this pan-Arab anti-Zionism or this Islamist anti-Zionism, are probably going to be the last people to let go of it. They're going to try to do everything they can, as they did on October 7th, to undermine normalization and to undermine the Arab and Muslim embrace of Zionism. But this is the direction we should be going in. This is the vision. This is the North Star. This is the only thing really worth working for.
So we are sitting here together today in large part because of Douglas Workman. So I want to thank Douglas, member of the congregation, who I think is one of your biggest fans, who has wanted us to sit together and talk and sent us an email that created this shidduch today. So thank you, Doug. He often quotes, we're going to jump from one book over one shoulder to another book over your shoulder. He often quotes your 2020 book, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. So many authors who are highly respected, who are on my shelf behind me, just like your works. I could go back to, Mika Goodman's Catch 67. I could go, to talk about Yossi Klein Halevi's Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. They seem to focus on reconciling the Six-Day War and especially the West Bank, as they call it, the territories, and coming up with some kind of solution. Your book, The War of Return, in so many ways posits that it's not 67 is not the issue. 48 is the issue. And the idea that somehow refugees have been created throughout wars, throughout the history of the world, and all of those refugees, including Jewish refugees from the Shoah and the refugees that were thrown out of Arab countries, have all come to terms with the idea that none of us are going back. And this is one population of refugee that is intentionally kept in refugee camps and intentionally fueled in so many ways for this constant argument and this false hope of this narrative that eventually one day they'll be able to return and take your home in Tel Aviv. My question to you is, because the book is outstanding, everybody should read The War of Return. Why do people continue to make the argument along the 67 lines? And do you think that will change now in light of October 7th?
I think people make the argument because ultimately it's an easier one. Because it's also a very Israeli argument. It's a Western argument. One of the things that I look at in the book, and we say it was actually never an Arab argument, and it was never a Palestinian argument. They never made the claim that their only beef with Israel and the Jewish people is the control of the West Bank and, at the time, Gaza. That was never, ever made from the Arab or Palestinian side. One of the things that I always say that I'm proud of the book, The War of Return, is that it gives Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word. And one of the things that you see once you survey the history is that they have been consistent. They have been consistent as to their complete rejection of the idea that the Jews should have a state in any part of the land. This is why there is 1948, because had they not rejected it, Jews and Arabs could have lived in two prosperous states already going back to the 30s. We actually might not have had the Holocaust in the scale that it was. This is something that pains me, that not enough is emphasized how Arab brutality and violence already in the 1930s, which led to British betrayal, led to the fact that the Jews did not have their state in the 1930s, as they should have, and were not able to open their doors to Jewish immigration when Jews could still get out of Europe. And it's actually a case in history where we have a comparison, because when Jews were ethnically cleansed from the Arab world in the 1950s and 60s, The difference from Europe was that this time there was a state of Israel that could open its borders and take in all the Jews who were fleeing the massacres and the ethnic cleansing in the Arab world. So the fact that Arabs rejected a Jewish state goes back to the 1920s and the massacre of Hebron, and they were very consistent. This is why in 1947 they reject partition, because the Jews are not happy. They're getting half of what they were offered, but at least it's a state. Jews, as a matter of top priority, want a sovereign state in the land, even if it's half. Arabs, as a matter of top priority, say that they want the Jews not to have a state. That's their top priority, which is why ever since, I mean, not only have they rejected partition and gone to war, every time they faced a choice where they could have their own state in part of the land, but the Jews would also have a state in the other part of the land, they said, absolutely not. That fails our primary priority, which is for the Jews not to have a state.
Just the very notion that the PLO was founded before 67.
Yes.
By Arafat in Cairo tells you everything, because what was their intent? What did they want to liberate before 67? They wanted to liberate Tel Aviv and Haifa and all of the cities that most Westerners think are going to eventually be part of Israel. And that's a given. That's pshita. That's simple. That's going to be Israel. And yet, when the PLO is founded, there is no territories. There is no lands gained by the 67 war. And so these fundamental issues that were established in the War of Independence in 1948, that were established before, I think, as you rightly point out, in the 30s and 40s, they've never been resolved. And the world has allowed this Palestinian cause to fester for so long under these very false notions, without ever correcting it and speaking openly and honestly and saying, you should move forward and try to build a better future for yourselves with that knowledge, just like Jews have moved forward and say, thank God we're not going back to Germany and Poland and Ukraine, and we're building for ourselves, and we're not going back to Iraq and Iran and Lebanon and Morocco, thank God. We're building for ourselves a better future in the land in which we live. And it's a must read. If you haven't read The War of Return, you have to read The War of Return. And once again, thank you, Doug, very much for setting this up. You served in the Knesset. You served as an advisor to Shimon Peres for many years, and a hero and a personal hero of mine. For a long time in Israel, the left has been in decline for a whole host of reasons. We are both published in a book that just was released. We both have essays in the book Jewish Priorities that was edited by David Hazoni. When you look at the Jewish priorities moving forward, is October 7th, does that demarcate the end of the Israeli left? Is there a rebuilding process that has to be a priority now moving forward for the Israeli left, where it regauges a kind of a sense of priorities based on the realities of the ground? Or in some ways, do you think it can be rehabilitated along the same lines as it once existed in the heyday of Peres and Rabin?
So I'm going to separate from several issues. First of all, I think that something that is actually October 7th led to immediate collapse is the notion that a purely right-wing government can be trusted to govern the state of Israel. Israel had only twice pure right-wing governments, in 1981 and this one. All other governments always had what I called the Mapainik babysitter. So the babysitter of the old labor, because the Israeli Labor Party, we call it left, but if you listen to how Ben-Gurion and Golda spoke, they would not be considered hippie leftists by any stretch of the imagination. They understood very clearly the threats that the Jews were facing in the region. They understood that Israel will have to make sure that it is strong, that it is the only way to survive in a hostile world and in a hostile environment. So there was, in that sense, nothing lefty about them the way we think about it today. But they were also devoid of any kind of messianic ideas that were also devoid from reality and were based basically on a notion that somehow God will provide. So they were hardened realists. So I just like to call them Mapai because I don't think they fit into left and right wing. Now, I have a colleague who said that one of the problems or one of the things that led to October 7th is that too many people have been living on the interest of what Mapai had created. So they no longer were aware of what was required to build the capital. And as a result, they thought that we could live in a country where you could like mess with it and you can take rather than give, and it would still hold. So I think the fact that the two right-wing governments have brought Israel to the brink in 81 with the Lebanon war, with the raging inflation, this government I don't need to expand. I actually think the willingness of Israelis to engage in any kind of experimentation where there's a pure right-wing government is gone. Now, the left, in the sense that we think of it since Oslo, the idea of land for peace, the idea that the only thing standing between us and peace is the Palestinians having a state in the West Bank and Gaza, that died with the fact that Palestinians basically walked away from opportunities to have a state and followed it with a wave of murderous massacres. Again, October 7th is not new in that respect. So Israelis for the last 20 years understood viscerally that it's not about what Israel does. I mean, we can retreat from territory, we can offer a state. Since the Palestinians remain committed to from the river to the sea, what are we going to offer them? So what you saw is an Israeli left that tried to go for social issues or tried to go on religion and state issues, but never addressed the issue directly. And what I hope will emerge, some people are arguing that this is what will emerge. Someone wrote a very thorough demographic analysis of what Israeli politics will look like after October 7th. And I wrote to him privately on Twitter. I was like, so you're basically saying, Israeli politics is going to look like me, in the sense of, on the one hand, basically going back to Mapai. So on the one hand, rejecting right-wing, messianic, taking all of Israel, God will provide ideas, but also rejecting any naive notions that if we only tried a little harder, the Palestinians would not have done October 7th. I think this is where the wide Israeli center lives. And I hope that there will be an understanding that this is what needs to govern Israel. Ben-Gurion is known for saying that he will govern without Chirut and Maki, essentially without the extreme right and without the communists. And that was basically kind of the notion of who can responsibly govern Israel. And I think, hopefully, this will be a return to that Israel can only be governed from what a friend of mine called a hawkish center.
So it's November 19th, and there's talk of a deal being made for, some articles say 50 of the hostages, some articles say 70 of the hostages. It feels as though the war cabinet, this inner circle of 5 people, are not in agreement, according to Jerusalem Post and Haaretz, which is the 2 things that I read in the morning. And we're trying to struggle to figure out how and if that's a good idea to release 50 or 70 and leave everybody else for the next round, and it just, without addressing it directly, What gives you hope in this moment? We're 6 weeks away. We're 6 weeks past October 7th. You are a politician and a pundit, and I think most of all, you're an educator. What gives you hope in this moment that people should hold on to, that Jews should hold on to around the world?
So what gives me hope is really looking at Israelis around me. And I'm sure you've heard it from many people. The mobilization of Israeli society, Jews and Arabs and Druze, I mean, a mobilization for the state, for the society, for helping each other has been remarkable. And it's amazing that it continues to be sustained. People have emerged to engage really in remarkable and inspirational activities of volunteerism and helping, and on the hostages, to bring the issue to world attention, to make sure that it's never out of anyone's minds. So this is what gives me hope. I mean, the sense, at least for me, is that out of October 7th, we will build better and stronger Israel. The other day, I was despairing because I met a friend who said, oh, nothing will change. It's all going to be the same. People are just going to revert to what happened before. And then I found that deeply depressing, because the only thing that really holds me these days is the hope that out of this despair and crisis and really just so much pain, we will create something that is better for Israelis, for the Jewish people, for the world at large. And I have to hold on to the hope that that's what's going to happen.
Thank you, Einat. You give me hope. Your writing gives me hope. Your messages give me hope. Your generosity to sit with Jewish leaders around the world and try to contextualize and explain what is going on and what you hope to see as we move forward gives me hope. And in so many ways, I think that the legacy of the late, great Shimon Peres has to be taken up by people. And he was somebody who looked at reality and saw beyond reality. He wasn't somebody who lived in some kind of dreamland as a hippy-dippy progressive, but he certainly saw an Israel 10 years into the future, 20 years into the future, 30 years into the future. And that's the Israel that he was building constantly throughout his life. And he left behind Talmidim like you that carry on that message of how do we do that together? How do we build the Israel of the future? Thank you for taking the time. I look forward to welcoming you here to Valley Beth Shalom one day soon, in Los Angeles, maybe on one of your next trips to LA. The congregation will get a chance to meet you and learn with you in person.
Thank you.